This is Daniel Sine from Baton Rouge Community College. This is my history podcast on the 19th century Europe and the rise of nationalism. Now, from last time, we had covered the Napoleonic period, and we had kind of wrapped up discussing how Napoleon was exiled. And I think we were just getting into discussing about the Congress of Vienna and what transpired in Europe in the post-Napoleon period. So that's the first thing we need to talk about, of course, this week, is what happened in post-Napoleon Europe. And afterwards, the Congress of Vienna basically changed the landscape of Europe and created a new political order. They, of course, nicknamed it the Age of Metternich, is one of the nicknames that kind of comes after the Napoleonic period. Usually goes from 1815 to about 1848. It was called that because it was heavily influenced by Clemens von Metternich, who was this chief minister and diplomat of Austria. Sometimes called Prince Metternich. I think they dubbed him too as well. And Metternich developed this system called the Metternich system, the Concert of Europe, the Vienna system, the Congress system. It was called all kinds of names. And it was this system that tried to beat back the whole status quo of liberalism, nationalism that I guess Napoleon had popularized. And the French, of course, because of the French Revolution, liberal ideas that were, from that time period. And so he began restoring a lot of monarchs to Europe that had been, taken off their thrones. And I think we talked about how Louis XVIII had been restored to the Bourbon dynasty in France, which we'll talk more about the Bourbons, of course, later. Of course, the main thing that came out of the whole Congress of Vienna was it created a balance of power in Europe between all the major powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and then France. And he later called it the Quintuple Alliance, was one of the nicknames they dubbed it. And this is the main, alliance of states that keeps that balance of power to prevent big wars from breaking out. Because remember, the Napoleonic Wars killed something like 3 million people. And so that was the whole point of it. And pretty much most of the 19th century was peaceful. There weren't that many wars. You had the Crimean War, the Franco-Prussian War, and a few others. But there weren't really any big wars until you get to World War I around 1914. Yeah, the 19th century is known, which we'll get to later, for the rise of nationalism. We'll get to that first. We'll get into the other stuff. And the 19th century is known for being the century of isms. Nationalism, liberalism, conservatism. You got socialism, you got Marxism, you got romanticism, you got imperialism, you got Zionism. It's like all kinds of isms. So it's known for a bunch of those things, which we'll talk about some of those later. But we'll first get into, of course, nationalism, which was real popular idea in the 1800s, 19th century. So what is nationalism? You can see in the notes here, it says that nationalism is it's a belief that a person's greatest loyalty should be to his or her nation or nation state. It's not just that. It's basically, it could be a group of people promoting a common thing, which could be anything. It could be the state itself. It could be self-government. It could be democracy. It could be common culture, common history, common language. It's just about all those kind of things can be part of it. And it is kind of linked to patriotism, but don't confuse the two. They're not the same thing, nationalism and patriotism, but they have kind of gone hand in hand, of course, for years. So it's a popular thing, that's created a lot of wars too, I think especially War One. I don't know about War II in my notes, but World War One is probably the big war we'll talk about later that really was caused a lot by nationalism, and so on. The word nation, you see, comes from a French word, which I think the pronunciation is nation, or something like that, N-A-T-I-O-N or N-A-C-I-O-N, they usually spell it. It's like a medieval term. And you look at Europe at the time, the map of Europe, you don't see states like Italy, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Poland. They don't exist yet until later. either in the later part of the 19th century or even in the early 20th century. Like Poland doesn't become a state again until like after World War I, as an example. Germany and Italy unified, of course, in the mid to late, 19th century, which is a major event that changed a lot of things in Europe. Big cause of World War I happened later because of Germany unifying. And they believe that modern nationalism in the 19th century was influenced by the French Revolution and also Napoleon. Napoleon influenced a lot of people. But the French Revolution got like the French to believe in themselves more patriotic about being French. They started to like think about self-government and democracy and things like that, and so they overthrew the absolutist type thing and went more to self-government, which they wanted. They also think that Napoleon influenced it too. As he conquered Europe, he spread a lot of the French Revolution ideas all over the place, so that affected people. It caused like Haiti and Latin America to, like in the Caribbean, to break away and declare their independence, because of that. They also believe that Napoleon, his invasions in Spain, Portugal, that touching off the Peninsular War we talked about before, last lecture, sparked the Latin American revolutions, where Mexico formed and Brazil formed and Argentina and Colombia and Venezuela, all those countries you think about later, all formed because of the Latin American revolutions, which were sparked by Napoleon, really. And of course, I talked about Italy and Germany unifying later. Hungary broke from Austria. You see that later too. They start breaking away, or they want to have their own power or political power, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire forming. But a lot of people like Poles, Slavs, groups like that are not really having their own states yet, which you'll see later. So you'll see these things eventually come about over time. Of course, one of the best examples of early nationalism in the 19th century was Greece. When Greece got its independence around 1830, Greece was an area that was actually controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which had been there for a while. I think going back to the 15th, 16th centuries, they controlled it. And part of what led to Greece forming was the fact that the Ottoman Empire was declining. A lot of people, especially in the 19th century, described Russia as being the sick man of Europe. The sick man dying in a bed kind of thing. And there was also the problem of the Eastern question, which I'll get to later, where a lot of people thought that if the Ottoman Empire declined, that would cause the whole balance of power in Europe to dissolve, So that's part of why a lot of countries intervened, but also to help out Greece, because Greece was the birthplace of, Greek culture, and democracy and all that. And eventually they did. In 1821, the Greeks revolted, what became known as they call it different names, the Greek War for Independence. I think the Greeks call it the Greek Revolt or Greek Revolution. That's what they called it. And for a few years they fought as rebels against the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, until the European powers, France, Britain, and Russia, decided to intervene. They were worried about what was going to happen if the Ottoman Empire broke up. And so they sent naval forces to help out the Greeks. And what happened was you had other like people volunteer. Like you had like guys like Lord Byron, you may have heard of. He was a romantic poet. He even volunteered. So you had Europeans that kind of decided, I want to fight for the Greeks and help them out. And so they went down there, actually helped. And Lord Byron actually died during the war from, I think, some kind of disease. So you had people volunteering to fight for this kind of cause of Greek independence. The pivotal battle in the Greek War was, of course, the Battle of Navarino that was fought in October of 20th, 1827. That was the pivotal battle of the whole war. And the combined naval force of Britain, Russia, and France obliterated the Turkish fleet in the Ionian Sea, which is kind of between Greece and Italy. That battle was considered the last major battle of the age of sail. At that point, ships still used sails, but at the time of the Crimean War, they started to use like steam type ships, and all that. And so anyway, that's kind of what that was famous for. And so that allowed the Greeks to become independent. So on March 25th, 1830, the Greeks declared their independence. That's still known as Greek Independence Day. So March 25th. 2 years later, Greece declared a kingdom of Greece. It was a kingdom for a long time until it later became a republic. So anyway, then you had other states that formed too, like Belgium. You see, 1839 was another state that formed too, and a very important one. But they formed, and they were always close with the British as kind of like an ally. Other states I've got too in that I'll kind of mention. Romania, 1877, became a nation state. Kingdom of Serbia, 1882. Bulgaria, it's a little later, but 1908 Bulgaria would form. So you see all those areas were controlled by the Ottoman Empire. That area starts breaking up, and so the Ottoman Empire is losing the eastern part of Europe that they once controlled for a long time. Nationalism also had other things like Zionism, I mentioned earlier. Arab nationalism too was something that kind of came out of nationalism in the 1800s as well. The nationalism spread to Italy as well. They got involved. The reason why was most of it had to do with Napoleon. Napoleon influenced Italian nationalism at first. And of course, from battles we talked about before in the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon had, invaded Italy and took control of it from France. It was like his first big campaign he had, you remember, 1796, I think it was. And later, when he was emperor, he then declared Italy a kingdom, and he called himself the King of Italy, which he did for around 10 years. So he actually kind of created an Italian state at one point. But after they exiled Napoleon, which is the Congress of Vienna, they basically got rid of the kingdom. And mostly Italy was occupied by foreign powers. Austria controlled most of the north. The southern part was controlled by like the Spanish, believe it or not. So the idea of Italian nationalism is still fresh. There was this guy named Giuseppe Mazzini who came about the 1820s roughly, and he popularized the idea of also another Italian national state as well. Mazzini was the original godfather of Italy. He really was. There's other guys like Garibaldi you may have heard of, who was big as well. And he formed this Italian nationalist movement. And there were two movements. The first one was the Risorgimento. Risorgimento was the overall nickname for what they call the Italian nationalist movement to unify Italy. And they wanted mostly an Italian republic. That's what they didn't really want a monarchy. It's funny, but they would anyway. But they wanted mostly an Italian republic. And he had this movement that was called Young Italy. And it had basically nothing but men that were like 40 and underneath it. With the movement. And the reason why they were 40 and under was because a lot of the Italian nationalists didn't trust the older people because they thought they were set in their old ways. They wouldn't want to have a republic. They're kind of used to monarchs maybe in some places. And so that's what the Risorgimento was about. And the word Risorgimento, by the way, does mean resurgence. That's the translation of it. Doesn't really say why, but it's the term resurgence is a term that basically just means resurgence in Italian nationalism. That's what they're talking about predominantly. Oh, Young Italy had a motto, by the way, which was union, strength, and liberty. And it's interesting about it. It later symbolized the Italian tricolor flag, if you know about this, which is red, white, and green. So that's where it originated from. It was originally this movement called the Young Italy. What happened to Mazzini? Well, he fell into the bad side of Metternich, who controlled a lot of the policies in Europe. And Mazzini was exiled, mostly through Metternich's. Metternich and Austria controlled a lot of northern Italy. I think he was exiled to France and other places, and so he never was able to really get the movement going. And it won't be until like the 1850s and 60s until Italy is actually unified as a state. That'll be done by the state called the Kingdom of Sardinia, which is in mostly northwestern Italy and also the island of Sardinia. That's the state that actually unifies Italy later. Then you had German nationalism as well. German nationalism was kind of took a while as well to take off. And what happened in Germany after the Napoleonic Wars was that the Congress of Vienna then created this collection of German-speaking states that was called the German Confederation. And it was an attempt to kind of bring back a similar type of thing that was comparable to the Holy Roman Empire. It was almost like a copy of it in a sense. Didn't have as many states as the Holy Roman Empire did, but it basically included about 39 that were mostly in the central part of Germany, from Prussia all the way down to Austria. It didn't really include the eastern part there, like eastern Prussia. I think Hungary wasn't in it and stuff like that. But the big powers that were in it were mostly Austria, Prussia. I think the other big one was the Kingdom of Bavaria. Yeah, Bavaria was in it. Switzerland wasn't in it though either, because I think they spoke some German. Yeah, German too. Yeah, and French too. But anyway, so it was kind of like a replacement state, for the whole Holy Roman Empire. It did have like a type of Congress or Parliament, which was called the Federal Diet, or also actually called the Federal Convention, is what they actually called it usually. But it was powerless. It was based in Frankfurt. It didn't really have a standing army, and so it's really not much of anything compared to what they had before, like the Diet of Worms. I think that was one of the Holy Roman Empire. But a lot of people think that the German Confederation was the next step towards unifying Germany, and most thought that Austria would work. Austria would work towards unifying Germany. That's not what happened. Later, we'll get to it in the 1860s. It's actually Prussia. Prussia's the state that's going to unify Germany, actually drive Austria out of it. They create kind of like their own confederation of states that eventually becomes the German Empire, but that'll happen eventually in the 1860s and early 1870s. So the German Confederation is like the next step towards unification, but it won't happen until later. Now in France, they went through all kinds of problems. They had kind of the combination of some reform and revolution at the same time throughout France. And basically, I told you what happened was after they got rid of Napoleon, they put the Bourbons back in. So they put in Louis XVIII in there. And Louis XVIII, I told you, was he was like the brother of Louis XVI. And I think I mentioned there was a Louis XVII, but he died in prison. So he didn't really count. And Louis XVIII was a constitutional monarchy. This is something that the Congress of Vienna pushed onto him, and they made him adopt the Constitution, which became known as it was called the Charter of 1814. The Charter of 1814 was a type of constitution that had basic democratic rights in it, which was based on the French Revolution and also the Napoleonic Code. So it protects people's like liberty, equality, freedom of speech, religion, equality for all man, protected people's private property, things like that. And under the constitutional government they had, constitutional monarchy, they had a bicameral parliament, the French parliament. And it had two chambers to it. It had a lower house, which was called the Chamber of Deputies, which was for the middle class. And they had another upper house, which was called a Chamber of Peers. And that one was for the nobility. Nobility under Louis XVIII were given more power again. The king had a lot of powers. If you study about this Constitution, the Charter of 1814, he could actually um, appoint officials, appoint judges. He could even create draft laws that he could give to the Parliament that he wanted passed. He was also a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So he had a lot of power, um, Louis XVIII. But he wasn't really that popular. You know, I don't think we'll get to his brother later. He wasn't popular either. And in a sense, he was trying to kind of bring back the old regime like in the old days. So he would rule till 1824. And then he had a brother who was named Charles X. And Charles X had a title. He was called the Count of Artois. They dubbed him. And he was this ultra royalist that came in after his brother died. He would reign 6 years, and of course Charles X is known, if you know about it, he was the last Bourbon king of the French. And part of what happened was he wanted to get rid of like the power that the middle class had, and he wanted most of the power to be in the hands of the nobility. He was like a absolutist. He really wanted to bring back that. He had total contempt for a limited monarchy. Once said about Britain and its limited monarchy, which is true, he said that I would rather be a woodcutter than be the king of England. And so, 1830, he passed a bunch of decrees that angered a lot of the middle class. They were called the July Ordinances. Yeah, July Ordinances. There was a bunch of decrees that did a bunch of things. One, it suspended the press in France. It took a lot of the rights away. It also dissolved the Chamber of Deputies. That was the main chamber for the middle class. He was going to try to get rid of it, I think. And I think he also he wanted to also exclude the middle class from future elections. Like try to basically, they wouldn't be able to vote either. And so this angered a lot of people. And so in July of 1830, all the people like in Paris revolted, like a lot of the middle class, mostly upper. It was like a combination of upper middle class and and also the working class that did it. And you might see a painting that's in the notes, which is called, look at the PDF lecture notes, and you'll see there's a painting there called Liberty Leading the People. That's a famous painting that was done right after, the revolt. It was done by Eugene Delacroix, and it depicts all the people rebelling, even women involved, even little kids with guns, like, man, getting involved also. The actual revolt lasted 3 days. They call it the July Revolution of 1830. The actual French call it another name, which is the Three Glorious Days. That's what they call it. And they overthrew his regime, Charles X, lasted from July 26th to about the 29th. And they actually forced Charles X to go into exile. You know where he went? England. That's ironic. So anyway, they got rid of him, and of course you would think, oh, let's put a republic in. No, they put another monarch in again. This time it's Louis Philippe the First. He becomes the ruler next. Who was he? He was a cousin of Charles X. He was from like a kind of a cousin of his that was like from they call the House of Orleans. He was like a cadet branch of the Capetians, which is the main dynasty that went back to medieval times. And he's interesting. He was kind of a liberal monarch who was elected to power, which was kind of unique about him. So he was like the first elected monarch of France. And they held like an election in 1830, like a plebiscite, and they voted him in. And so because of it, he was called names like the Citizen King, is what people called him. He was also called the July Monarch or July Monarchy. They dubbed him because he was put in power in July. And then he had his own name he called himself, which was Roi de France, which means in French, King of the French. That's what he preferred to be called. So he was a constitutional monarchy. he pretty much adopted the Charter of 1814 that had been there before by Louis XVIII. And what was he known for? Louis Philippe I was known for different things. He reigned 18 years, 1830 to 48. It's not in your notes, but he is known for beginning the French conquest of Algeria, which is in North Africa. The French started that in 1830. They conquered it by 1857, I think is when they finished conquering. So that's one thing he did. Also, another thing he did that's real famous was in 1840. He decided he was going to return the remains of Napoleon to France, who was still buried in St. Helena in the South Atlantic. And so this became known as the Retour des Cendres. It's called the French name they called it, which is the return of the ashes of Napoleon. Napoleon was brought back, given like great honors. He was buried in Paris, and you can see Les Invalides, which Invalides is a French series of museums and tombs where a lot of the French war heroes are buried. That's where he was buried. So he was given all great honors. So how Napoleon's like after that starts getting idolized, and of course on the bad side it made the Bonapartists as they call them later, more popular than kings like Louis Philippe. So now Louis Philippe gets overthrown too. It's like another revolution is next, and February of 1848 he gets overthrown as well. You'll see what's going to happen is the French then put in a republic instead. That was part of a series of revolutions you see in the notes that was called the Revolutions of 1848. And these were a series of revolutions that basically were all over Europe. They were just in a bunch of areas. People, you can see the people that were mostly the middle class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class types. They were the ones that mostly rebelled against the conservative Metternich system we talked about. They thought that pretty much that wasn't working. And a lot of these people wanted more rights and so on. They think there's a lot of causes of it. I got a bunch in the notes you can see there. They do think that bad harvests may have helped to contribute to why they broke out initially. Like in 1847, they had some bad harvests. They think that was caused by the Little Ice Age, which was actually still going on at that time, the little cooling period we talked about before. They think that caused bad harvests and also higher food costs and all that, and so that was kind of a problem. High unemployment, bad working conditions would stem from the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution had started in the 19th century, but a lot of the changes hadn't caught up to the workers, and they weren't getting paid enough, so that kind of contributed to it. And then also lack of political power. That was another thing among a lot of the middle class. They wanted more freedom of the press, more democracy, more self-government, and that led to a lot of nationalist causes. Also led to the rise of socialism, I'll get to later. And so all these kind of things led to revolutions all over the place. So what were countries that had it? I got the main ones: Hungary, Germany, Austria, France. Also happened in Prussia, Denmark, Netherlands, a bunch of countries kind of went through different revolutions. For some reason, it didn't affect Britain, which I don't know why, but it didn't, And also Italy, I think, had some as well. So now I'll give you some examples of some that are not in the notes, but like in Denmark, they got rid of absolutism. They went to more of a Republican type government, which Holland will have later. Prussia even adopted a constitution, which was the Constitution of Prussia in 1850. And Prussia was one of the first states, believe it or not, to give what they call universal male suffrage, which is the right to vote to all men. So they did that, and other countries would follow later. Like the French would do it next, I think, the 1850s. Emperor Napoleon III as well. So, they had the most famous part of the revolution was the French one, the February Revolution of 1848, which took place between February 22nd to 24th. And Louis Philippe's government is overthrown in a coup at that point. He was forced out into exile at that point. The French at that point said, hey, we're tired of a monarchy. let's go try the Republican thing again. And so, guess what? In 1848, they form another republic, which is the French Second Republic that they'll have. So, what happens at that point is the French adopt another constitution, which is the Constitution of 1848. And this is the most famous constitution they probably had, after this period, around this time. And that's the constitution that created the French presidency. So after this, the main ruler of France would mostly be a president, like Macron. Emmanuel Macron is the current president now. And with this constitution, the French president served a four-year term, and that was it. You had to step down. It also had a French parliament, which had two houses. The lower house is called the National Assembly. So you got that name for the French Revolution. And then the upper house is called the Senate. I think it's pretty much what they have today, which hasn't changed too much. So that's kind of what the new kind of government that they brought in there at that point. And so in 1848, the French held the first presidential election in France's history. And guess who they elected? This guy back here, of course, which is, his real name is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Yeah, that's his name there. And who is he? He's a nephew of Napoleon. He had been in exile for years. And I think in the 1840s, he came back to France. Bonapartes, of course, were real popular still. And, of course, they have this political party called the Bonapartists, I think they had in France. They wanted to put some of the Bonapartes back on. I think they wanted to put Napoleon II on the throne originally, but he died young, in the early 1830s. He was like in his 20s when he died, so scratch that guy. So they had this one next, which is his nephew, that, of course, would come in later. And so he ran for the presidency, and he got 74% of the vote, like a majority, more than a majority. So he got elected. However, he didn't like the title President of France. You know what he liked to be called? The Prince President. Yeah, with a dash in it. And so that's what he liked to be called. And so he was served his 4-year term. However, by the end of 1851, by December, he realized that he would have to step down soon in 1852. And so if you know what happened, Louis Napoleon decided to start a coup, which he did. And guess what date? December 2nd. Yes, 1851, which is ironic because that's the same date that his uncle was crowned emperor. And so he overthrows the republic, basically. And, of course, in 1852, what he, of course, does is he forms another empire. That's the Second French Empire, which will last from 1852 to 1870. Of course, he took up a name, title and name that went with it. And so what they called him afterwards was, of course, Emperor, Napoleon III. So that's the name he's called afterwards, the little emperor. He's about the same height as Napoleon, about 5'6", 5'7". Of course, if you look at him, he's known for his famous goatee. He's got those little handlebar mustaches, which were real popular the way of the 19th century, basically. It's kind of like, it actually made it real popular. A lot of people started wearing that kind of facial hair. They don't really see goatees much like that anymore, but it was kind of popular, a long time ago. And talk a little bit about him, of course, some of the things that Napoleon III did. Kind of go through that information on that. Now, Napoleon III is known for a lot of things in a short period overall. He's the guy that pretty much modernized France and kind of started industrializing it. That's about when the Industrial Revolution takes off. One of the things he did that's real famous is he totally redesigned Paris, like literally. Like if you go to Paris today, pretty much the way all the buildings and streets are is because of what he did. And so he began doing that. So he had this whole public works program to totally redo the whole city, overall. He say he modernized the economic system, the banking system, and the rail system, and canals, and things like that, throughout France, and all of that. course, he helped sponsor the Suez Canal. That's one thing that's real famous that he did. The Suez Canal, as you know, is a famous canal that was built between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. It was built to connect Europe with like Asia and the East. So you didn't have to go around Africa and all that. And it was developed from a company that was called, you want to know, the Suez Canal Company. It was run by this guy named Ferdinand de Lesseps. He ran it. And they finished it in 1869, and the French and British actually co-owned it until 1956, until the Egyptians took it from them. The Republic of Egypt stole it from them. So anyway, also Napoleon was a staunch conservative, and one thing that he tried to do was he tried to get rid of all the dregs of society in France. So anybody that was a bad person, like criminals or whatever, they got rid of them. They sent them to their colonies, and one place they sent them to, which was very notorious, if you know about this, was French Guiana. French Guiana was this French penal colony that was created in South America. And we'll talk about it later. I have a video later this week that you'll see that's about the Devil's Island prison system they had there, which was really notorious. One of the worst prisons in the world you could be sent to. They sent like 70,000 people there, and like 3/4 of them died. You know, I think only 7,000 came back to France afterwards. So like you had a 10% chance of actually getting back to France later. So if you got sent there, you weren't coming back. He also helped to colonize French Indochina in the 1860s. He did that. He also finished the conquest of Algeria. So there's all these colonial things he was doing. He got France involved in the Crimean War. I'll get to that later, where they fight Russia. And then he also helped Italy unify. I think he helped the Kingdom of Sardinia drive out the Austrians and unify Italy. He was known for that. He was also known for this thing you may have heard of called the French intervention in Mexico, where the French went into Mexico because the Mexicans weren't paying their debts they owed. Mexico was a republic at the time. And in the 1860s, from about 1861 to about 1867, the French tried to take over Mexico with their forces. It was called the French intervention in Mexico. And what the French tried to do there was they tried to create an empire there, which was called the Second Mexican Empire. And Napoleon III put one of his cousins on the throne, who was from Austria, by the name of Maximilian. Maximilian, they called him. He was called Emperor Maximilian I. He was the only ruler of it. And the French forces overran the Mexico mostly, but there were battles like the Battle of Puebla, which is the most famous battle fought probably in the whole war. It was fought on May 5th, 1862. That battle was kind of important because it they said it boosted Mexican morale and Mexican nationalism because they actually defeated a French army. And in America, they call it Cinco de Mayo. You know, they celebrate every May, eat a lot of Mexican food, and all that. But some of the Mexicans actually call it the Day of the Battle of Pueblo, is what they actually call it. So yeah, Maximilian didn't fare well, if you know about it. They eventually captured him, the Mexicans, and they shot him. Yeah, they did. They shot the guy, poor guy. And there's one more thing that Napoleon III is involved in later, which we'll get to later in another lecture. Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71. He picks a fight with the Prussians, the Germans, which had a better military. They got their butts whipped. And Prussia actually overrun France, capture Paris. And poor Napoleon III is forced to abdicate his throne. And so the French, after that, decide we've had enough of monarchs. And they declare a republic permanently. So I'll get to that later, but France is pretty much a republic from 1870 to the present overall. He did do some political things that were kind of interesting as a reformer. The big thing he did, if you know about it, Napoleon III, was he gave all men in France universal suffrage, the right to vote. But women still didn't have any rights in France. Not until the early 20th century, though. So that's it for this podcast, this section here. This is like part one. Part two on the 19th century, I'll also talk about Russia like the post-Napoleon period of Russia in the 19th century. Yeah, so we'll get to that and discuss what happened with that as well. So that's it for this podcast.